All right, so the last couple days you guys learned about cell respiration and how your body uses oxygen and uses glucose to generate ATP. Now, the problem is that we mentioned that you need to use oxygen. Well, sometimes there isn't enough oxygen in order for cell respiration to happen, but our body still does need ATP, and it does go through a different process that produces just small quantities of ATP called fermentation. So we're going to focus on that today. So fermentation is an anaerobic process, and what that means that it is not going to require oxygen. Now, if you guys remember when we learned about prokaryotic organisms, you might remember that we mentioned that they don't have organelles. That's one of the defining characteristics between them and eukaryotic cells. Well, because prokaryotic cells don't have organelles, they don't have mitochondria, and because of that, they can't go through cell respiration. So when we're talking about fermentation, this is the only way that things like bacteria and other types of prokaryotic organisms can get their energy, because again, they lack the mitochondria. Now, if you remember from talking about glycolysis, glycolysis is an anaerobic reaction, and that means that that reaction also does not require oxygen. And because it happens in the cytoplasm, you're going to see that fermentation also is going to be happening inside of the cytoplasm. We have two different types that we're going to talk about. You can go through alcoholic fermentation or lactic acid fermentation, and we'll talk about which one that we go through as well. So again, after glycolysis, just to sum it up, if oxygen is not present, then it will go through fermentation right in the cytoplasm. If oxygen is present, though, then the pyruvate, which was produced from glycolysis, will go to the mitochondria so that cell respiration can take place and generate more ATP. So as I mentioned, guys, there are two main types of fermentation. We have lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation is the kind that we as animals go through. We have lactic acid that builds up in our muscles, and you might have noticed this if you were exercising excessively, maybe through a sport. Usually in my class we do a demonstration where I have you guys do a wall sit, and if you do a wall sit, you feel your legs start to burn. That burning is fermentation happening inside of your muscles, and what it is, that burning that you feel, is the buildup of lactic acid over time. You might see that athletes have those rollers that they can kind of roll and push that lactic acid out of their muscles, but for the most part it's a way of your body telling you that you're pushing yourself too far, that you don't have enough oxygen to support in those cells, so it goes through fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation is another type, and we see that types of bacteria and yeast in particular goes through this, and other types of protists, and basically they go through a different reaction where alcohol is produced. This is the same alcohol that you would see in beer and wine and other types of hard liquor, and there are different processes, and typically Saccharomyces yeast is the type that is used specifically in beer, and wine, but there are other types as well that could be used. So through lactic acid fermentation, we'll start out with that one. Cells use lactic acid fermentation to basically take the pyruvic acid and the NADH that was created in glycolysis and generate lactic acid and NAD+. And that last molecule, NAD+, is the real reason why we need fermentation to happen. Remember that glycolysis produces 2 ATP, which is great. That's the small amount of ATP that we're able to generate through this process, but we need NAD+ to pick up the electrons and be converted in NADH back in glycolysis. Well, eventually we're going to run out of these NAD+ molecules because all of them will be holding electrons. So what your cells do is they go through a different type of reaction called fermentation, and in this case lactic acid fermentation is going to basically give those electrons and those hydrogen ions back to the pyruvic acids, generating lactic acid. That's pretty much all you guys will need to know. Just know especially that this process, by doing glycolysis and then fermentation, it only generates 2 ATP, so much, much less. The second thing I want you guys to know is that the reason of fermentation is we're trying to free up those NADH molecules, generating more NAD+. Alcoholic fermentation is very similar. The differences are going to be in the molecules that are produced, but as far as you guys, what you need to know, you're starting off with exactly the same stuff, pyruvic acid and NADH, and the end result is just going to be a little different. In this reaction, you see that alcohol carbon dioxide is also produced, and then again that NAD+. And the only thing I'm really going to have you guys remember is, again, that fermentation, the main purpose is to free up those NADH molecules and generate NAD+, so that glycolysis can happen again, generating again only 2 ATP through this process. Now, comparing that to cell respiration, remember that we generated 38 ATP or 36 ATP net in cell respiration, so much more when oxygen is present, and that's why we need oxygen to survive. Without it, we would die. So if you take a look here, this last slide just shows you some different types of organisms that go through fermentation, and you can see I mispronounced a little bit, but it's Saccharomyces is the type of yeast organism that will be used in the liquors that we produce. Clostridium is a type of, I believe, bacteria that is used in acetone and isopropanol. You have different types over here that you guys can take a look at. One really interesting thing that I always talk about is Swiss cheese. Where the holes come from is actually fermentation that is occurring inside of the cheese. And if you remember that in alcoholic fermentation, it also produced small amounts of carbon dioxide. So in this case, it's not alcoholic, the alcohol that's being produced, it's prokaryotic acid, but you do see the carbon dioxide also being produced, which is the thing that actually leaves the holes in the cheese, this buildup of the carbon dioxide gas. Alright, so that's fermentation. Hopefully you guys learned it, and please let me know if you guys have any questions.